Dreams, struggles, failures and triumphs, the evolution of culture, collective growth, narratives that must be told. The Bahamas has a rich cultural heritage that is documented and preserved in the National Archives of the Bahamas.
In 1812, the British government mandated that every slave in the British Caribbean be registered. However, a slave register was not created for the Bahama Islands until 9 years later.
The slave register was created on the 6th of April, 1821, after much work by Wilberforce and his anti-slavery colleagues who thought that a slave registration was necessary to combat the illegal trafficking of slaves throughout the British colonies.
The first slave register in the Caribbean was done in Trinidad in 1812, with the law being passed in 1815. However, the Bahamas House of Assembly did not appreciate the fact that the British government wanted them to register their slaves, because the Bahamas, as you know, is an archipelagic nation, and most of the slaves were mariners. They were used on the ships. They moved from island to island. And the House of Assembly felt that the act was too vague with regards to these particular slaves. So they didn't want to register the slaves, and they also felt that it would be too arduous because of the far-flung islands. So instead of our slave registers beginning in 1816, ours began in 1821.
For over a century, the Slave Register of the Bahamas was secured in the Registrar General's Department. In 1971, when the Bahamas Department of Archives opened its doors for the first time, the first Bahamian archivist, Gail Saunders, ascertained the slave register, placing it in the archives for further preservation.
The slave registers were some of the first records that were brought into the archival repository. We've had them for 52 years, and they are available for to see, but we normally let people use the microfilm when they come. They are microfilm because, as you can see, they are old and really should not be handled without wearing a glove, because our job primarily is to preserve the records. That is what the archives was created for: preservation. Preservation. The register is significant because, number one, it gave a listing of all the slaves in the Bahamas. Number two, it gave the sex, where the slave was born, as well as the age. So that was important because now you had like a comprehensive statistical summary of the amount of slaves in the Bahamas.
The slave register is of national significance because it represents a vital primary source for academics and family historians or genealogists who want to collect statistical data, and it is also a valuable source of our cultural heritage in the Bahamas, where persons can trace their family history and know their origins. The significance then was it was a legal record of slaves owned by masters, and like I said, it prevented trafficking. So it was a step on the way to the abolitionist agenda.
As time progressed, much of the opposition to slave registration was linked to the Wiley affair, which created a serious rift between the executive and legislature. Longtime Attorney General for the colony, William Wiley, had reportedly converted to abolitionism.
Wiley, if we study his background, he became more empathetic to slaves. He actually communicated back and forth in London with a abolitionist society there. And Wiley was involved in a case where a slave owner, Mr. Cunningham, he brought his slave to New Providence, Sandy, a male slave. But prior to that, a female slave, Sue, had also come to New Providence. And Sandy and Sue had a child. And Mr. Cunningham, the slave owner, wanted to take back Sandy, Sue, and the child back to Georgia with him. However, Wiley, the then Attorney General, he interfered and said, you can take Sandy and the child, but you cannot take Sue. So then a controversy erupted between the House of Assembly and the then Attorney General Wiley. And the House of Assembly wanted Wiley to give an account for this decision. Now, Wiley, who had a plantation, we know today, in the area of Tusculum and Clifton, he encamped himself at his plantation, arming his slaves. When the government officials couldn't get to him, he then ended up being imprisoned because of this act. Now, this case was also an impediment to those slave registration being done in the Bahamas.
Between 1819 and 1834, the Creole population grew steadily.
Creole refers to enslaved persons that were born in the Bahama Islands, while African refers to those first-generation slaves with a direct, unbroken link to Africa.
The earlier years indicated that the African-born population, slave population, was higher. But by 1834, the Creolized slaves were higher because it was 90%, and as compared to about 70% earlier. And this is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was because no African slave could be imported because of the end of the slave trade in 1807. We know the abolitionists led by William Wilberforce agitated enough until they got the 1807 slave trade ban. So slave registration was like the second step in the move towards total abolition. Because in order to ensure that there was no trading of slaves, you had to register them. And then if you got a new slave, you're going to want to know where did it come from. Especially when you begin to look at if you have an African-born. But where does African-born slave come from at 35? When there's supposed to be no slave traffic. So that is how I would connect, personally. I would connect the slave registration process, because after that slave registration process, then you had the amelioration process, which is the new slave code in 1824, the next new slave code in 1826, and then we moved on to abolition in 1834 and complete abolition in 1838.
If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. Frederick Douglass.